Welcome, restless souls, to Carman's Crypt. I'm Carman, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carman's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes to life. This is Carman's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. The job posting had almost been too good to be true. $18 an hour to sit in an empty building for 8 hours, 5 nights a week. Zayne Thibodaux had been desperate enough after losing his warehouse job that he hadn't asked too many questions. After 3 years of loading trucks and managing inventory, the company had downsized, leaving him with just enough savings to cover maybe 2 months of rent on his Marigny apartment. At 28, Zayne was used to starting over, growing up in the Bywater with his grandmother after his parents moved away. He had learned to roll with whatever New Orleans threw at him. The warehouse job had been steady, good money, but now he was back to taking whatever work he could find. The security supervisor had been vague about the location, just overnight security at a medical facility undergoing renovation, and had insisted they meet at a coffee shop rather than the actual site. Now, standing in front of the towering facade of Memorial Medical Center, Zayne understood why. The building loomed against the New Orleans sky like a monument to abandonment. Plywood covered most of the lower windows, and those that remained intact reflected nothing but darkness. Water stains crept up the brick walls like reaching fingers, marking where Hurricane Katrina's flood had touched nearly 20 years ago. Zayne had only been 9 when the storm hit, too young to really understand what was happening when his grandmother packed their most important belongings and they evacuated to his cousin's place in Baton Rouge. By the time they returned months later, the Bywater house had been gutted and rebuilt, and life moved on. For years, Katrina had been just history to him, a story adults told about before the storm and after the storm. But standing here now, something about this place made his skin crawl in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. The hospital structure had been gutted, renovated, abandoned again, and now set in bureaucratic limbo, while some development company figured out what to do with it. Zayne checked his phone. 10:47 p.m. His shift started at 11. The key was supposed to be in a lockbox by the service entrance, just as his supervisor had said. The metal box hung from a chain-link fence that surrounded the construction equipment. Bulldozers and dumpsters scattered across what had once been a parking lot. Everything was silent except for the distant hum of the city and the rustle of plastic sheeting in the breeze. The service door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty corridors beyond. Zayne's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing institutional tile floors marked with muddy boot prints from construction workers. The air was stifling, thick with humidity and a strange smell, something stale and oppressive that seemed to press against his chest. According to the instructions he had been given, his job was simple. Walk the perimeter every 2 hours, check that the construction equipment was secure, and make sure no one broke in. There was a security desk on the 7th floor where he could spend the rest of his time. Easy money. The elevator was obviously out of service, so Zayne found the stairwell. His footsteps echoed strangely in the concrete shaft, creating patterns of sound that echoed and seemed to follow him up through floor after floor. By the time he reached the 7th floor, sweat was already beading on his forehead despite the September night. The security desk sat at the end of a long hallway lined with empty rooms. Someone had left a folding chair, a small table, and an extension cord snaking down from a ceiling fixture that provided the only working light in the area. Zayne settled in with his thermos of coffee and a paperback novel. The air conditioning wasn't working. That much was obvious from the oppressive heat that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, but he had dealt with worse conditions before. By midnight, he had finished his first patrol. Everything was secure. The construction equipment sat undisturbed, and all the entrances were properly locked. He returned to his post and tried to read, but the silence was unnerving. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty building, but something more oppressive, as if the hospital was holding its breath. It was just after 1 a.m. when he first heard the dripping. The sound came from somewhere down the hall, steady rhythmic drops hitting tile. Zayne followed the sound with his flashlight, checking each empty room as he passed. The dripping seemed to move, always just around the next corner, always just out of sight. When he finally traced it to what looked like a patient room at the far end of the corridor, the sound stopped. The room was empty except for stripped walls and a pile of old ceiling tiles in the corner. But the air felt different here, heavier and even more oppressive. Hot in a way that made his shirt stick to his back immediately. As he turned to leave, he heard something else. A faint splashing sound, like someone moving through shallow water. Zayne aimed his flashlight at the floor. The tiles were dry, but the sound continued. Soft, irregular splashes that seemed to come from empty air. He backed out of the room, his heart rate picking up. The second patrol at 3 a.m. revealed more sounds. Muffled voices calling for help, always from rooms he had just checked and found empty. The whisper of fabric against tile, like hospital gowns dragging across the floor. And underneath it all, the persistent sound of labored breathing. Dozens of people struggling for air in the thick, stifling heat. In the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors, the temperature spiked so suddenly that Zayne had to stop and catch his breath. The air was like a furnace, dry and burning in his lungs. For a moment, he felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the air around him. That's when he felt the first touch. Invisible fingers grabbed at his shirt, his arms, pulling him back toward the 7th floor. The touches were desperate, frantic, like people reaching for help in deep water. Each contact sent a shock of heat through his system that had nothing to do with the temperature. The burning sensation of panic, of desperate need. Back at his desk, Zayne tried to focus on his book, but the words seemed to swim on the page. The coffee had gone warm and bitter, and when he lifted the thermos to his lips, he realized his hands were shaking. The hospital felt different now. Awake, somehow aware, and very, very angry. At 5 a.m., during his final patrol, the sounds had intensified beyond bearing. The splash of rising water echoed from every room, accompanied by voices calling out, not for rescue, but in accusation. Why did you leave us? Where were the boats? We waited so long. The phantom hands were everywhere now, grabbing at him with increasing desperation, pulling him toward rooms that felt like ovens. In one room, the heat was so intense that his flashlight seemed to dim in the suffocating air. And in that dimness, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Dark stains on the walls that looked almost like handprints, dozens of them, reaching up toward the ceiling as if people were trying to climb away from rising water. The splashing sounds grew louder, more frantic. The invisible hands pulled at him with increasing urgency, and through the chaos of sounds, he began to hear something else. The distinct beep of medical equipment, the hiss of ventilators, the quiet murmur of people too weak to cry out. And then, cutting through it all, a voice that was different from the others. Calm, clinical, speaking in measured tones. This will help the pain. Zayne stumbled backward, his light dancing wildly across the walls. For just a moment, in the shifting beam, the handprints seemed to move, reaching not up toward safety, but out toward him, as if pleading for something he couldn't understand. Zayne ran. He didn't stop until he reached the parking lot, where he sat gasping in his car until dawn broke through the humid air. When his relief arrived, a tired-looking day security guard who barely grunted a greeting, Zayne was packed and ready to leave. But as he drove away, he realized the heat was following him. Over the next few days, Zayne tried to put the hospital out of his mind. He told himself it had been his imagination, the product of a creepy building and too much caffeine. But the hot spots began appearing in his apartment. First in the bedroom, where the temperature would suddenly spike while he was trying to sleep, making him gasp and scramble for the air conditioning that never seemed cold enough. Then in the kitchen, where invisible hands would grab at his clothes while he tried to eat. The sensation was always the same, that suffocating heat accompanied by the feeling of desperate people trying to pull him toward something. By the weekend, Zayne knew he had to go back. He drove to the hospital during the day, when sunlight made the building look merely abandoned rather than malevolent. The construction crew was off for the weekend, so the site was empty. He parked across the street and stared at the building, trying to work up the courage to approach. That's when he noticed the woman sitting on a bench near the bus stop. She was elderly, with silver hair and dark skin, wearing a scrubs top that looked too formal for a Saturday afternoon. When she saw him looking, she walked over to his car. "You worked in there," she said. It wasn't a question. Zayne nodded, unsure how she could know. "My daughter used to work there too," she continued. "Before the storm. She was a nurse on the 7th floor. You probably don't remember much about Katrina. You look too young. But it was bad. Real bad." Zayne nodded. He'd been just a kid when it happened, but his grandmother had told him stories that had seemed distant and abstract until now. How the water kept rising even after the storm passed. How people got trapped in places that were supposed to be safe. Standing here, looking at this haunted building, those stories felt suddenly, terrifyingly real. After the hurricane, when the power went out and the water kept rising, they moved as many patients as they could to the higher floors, the woman said. But some couldn't be moved. The old ones, the sick ones. And when the air conditioning failed and the temperature kept climbing, she trailed off, staring at the hospital. 45 people died in that building, she whispered, most of them on the 7th floor. My daughter, she never talked much about what happened those last days, but she said some of the doctors, they made hard choices, gave medicine to help people who were suffering, people who couldn't be saved. Zayne felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade. The state tried to prosecute, the woman continued, said it was murder. But my daughter, she said those doctors were trying to be merciful. When you're trapped in 110-degree heat with no power, no water, no way out, and you know help isn't coming, sometimes the kindest thing is to help someone find peace. She looked directly at Zayne then, her eyes sharp and knowing. They're not angry about dying, baby. They're angry about being forgotten, about having their stories twisted into something ugly, when all anyone was trying to do was help. The words reminded him of something his grandmother used to say, that the dead don't rest easy when they're forgotten. Growing up in New Orleans, you learned that the city had layers, history that sometimes bled through into the present. His grandmother had taught him to respect that, even if he didn't fully understand it. As the sun set, Zayne used his keys to enter through the service door of the hospital, but this time he came prepared. He had brought a portable fan, bottles of cold water, and a thermos full of iced tea. It felt ridiculous, but the old woman's words had stayed with him. The hot spots were waiting for him. On the 7th floor, he set up the fan in the room where he'd first felt the heat. The invisible hands touched him immediately, but this time he didn't pull away. Instead, he spoke to the empty air. "I'm here," he said softly. "I know it was hot. I know you suffered." The touching intensified, dozens of phantom fingers grasping at his shirt, his arms, his face. But instead of the desperate grabbing he'd experienced before, it felt different now, more like gratitude. He moved through the hospital systematically, setting up the fan in each hot spot, leaving bottles of cold water on windowsills, pouring iced tea into paper cups, and placing them where beds might have been. With each gesture, the desperate quality of the touching seemed to fade, replaced by something gentler. In the room where the handprints had appeared on the walls, Zayne found a pile of old medical records that the construction crew had missed. Water-damaged and barely legible, they told the story the woman had hinted at. Patients who had died not from drowning, but from heat exhaustion and dehydration as the floodwaters rose and the building's climate control systems failed. 45 names, 45 people who had died in sweltering heat, waiting for help that came too late. For the first time in his life, Hurricane Katrina wasn't just a childhood memory of evacuation and rebuilding. It was real human suffering, real deaths that had been forgotten and misunderstood. The weight of that realization settled on him like the heat that had been following him through the hospital. Zayne read each name aloud, and with each one, the temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly. The invisible hands still touched him, but now they felt cool against his skin. By dawn, the hospital was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the oppressive silence of abandonment, but the peaceful quiet of rest. The hot spots were gone, and the phantom touches had faded to the occasional brush against his shoulder, a reminder rather than a plea. Zayne continued working at the hospital through the renovation, watching as the building was slowly transformed into luxury condos. The developers didn't know that he had a memorial plaque installed in the lobby, small and discreet, listing 45 names under the inscription, in memory of those who found peace here during the storm. Sometimes, on particularly hot nights, he still felt the gentle touch of invisible fingers, but they were cold now, and they felt like gratitude rather than desperation. The dead had finally been remembered for who they really were, not victims of murder, but people who had suffered and died in impossible circumstances, cared for by medical staff who had done their best in an unthinkable situation. The old woman never appeared at the bus stop again, but Zayne kept her words with him. They're not angry about dying, baby. They're angry about being forgotten. And now, finally, they were remembered. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carman's Crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carman's Crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.